we learned yesterday that our guest at our last program last fall, James Foreman Jr., the author of a book called Locking Up Our Own Crime and Punishment in Black America. Yesterday he was awarded the Pulitzer Prize for nonfiction, so we're proud of James and glad that we had him here, and Tucker Carrington kind of helped carry on the program by serving as his interlocutor when he was here. So
I hope this is the first step towards getting a Pulitzer as you show up here. So I'm ready for 2018.
Should that karma play over for your book this next year? Anyway, before I introduce our guest this evening, I just wanted to point out we will, as always, have a reception in the lobby afterwards, and there will be books on sale, copies of The Cadaver King and The Country Dentist. Now, is that not a great title for a book? We had planned to have the two authors here this evening, but Radley Balko called in yesterday ill, and he said more importantly, he didn't say it was in an email, he's unable to talk. So we have found a splendid substitute, our own Cynthia Joyce from the Ole Miss Journalism School, and Cynthia's quite conversant with the bizarre cases that unfold in the book, so she'll be first rate. And of course, we're delighted, as always, to have Tucker Carrington with us. He's director of the George C. Cochran Innocence Project at the Ole Miss Law School. I suspect a lot of you know this, but it's worth noting that the Innocence Project was started here about 10 years ago when John Grisham was the driving force behind it. And right away, they began to make a big splash by freeing two men from Noxubee County who had been falsely convicted of murder in two separate cases based on evidence from the Cadaver King and his cohort, the Country Dentist. So we're looking forward to hearing tales of this nefarious pair, and we're delighted to have you. So Tucker and Cynthia, the floor is yours.
Thank you.
Thanks, Curtis.
So yes, I'm definitely not Radley Balko. I'm just a resident journalism professor here, and but I've been really interested in your work, and ever since also watching the documentary that was made on a similar subject a few years ago. I remember being here in this room and learning about that, and at that time being like, how does that happen? How is that even possible that this happens? But well, first of all, congratulations, because the book has been getting great reception.
Thank you.
Been getting covered by Wall Street Journal, New York Times, all over the place. Publishers Weekly, in a starred review, called it a clear and shocking portrait of the structural failings of the U.S. criminal justice system. This eminently readable book builds a hard-to-ignore case for comprehensive criminal justice reform. So maybe you can just start by telling us a little bit about who the Cadaver King and the Country Dentist, like what their role was. You were successful in exonerating LaVon Brooks and Kennedy Brewer, but what was the role? Who were the Cadaver King? And just if you could tell us briefly.
Well, as Curtis mentioned, let me back up just a little bit. When I got here, when I moved down to take this job in 2007, sort of the summer of 2007, into that fall, the Innocence Project in New York, which Peter Neufeld and Barry Scheck had founded about 12 years prior to that. They had been working all over the country on a number of cases, including the two cases that form the narrative sort of arc of the book, the LaVon Brooks and Kennedy Brewer cases. They had been working on them for a number of years, and they were generous enough to ask me to come and sort of get acquainted with the cases. This was in August of 2007, or the beginning of September, I think. As it turned out, right around the turn of the year, the cases were solved. I won't go into the details of all of that, but the true perpetrator was identified, who had abducted and murdered these 2 3-year-old girls in separate cases. And the Innocence Project, in this case, Peter Neufeld and Vanessa Potkin, who were the attorneys on the case, asked us to come in and sort of co-counsel the case with them. And it turned out to be the best of both worlds, because we didn't have to pay for any of the DNA testing, and we got a bunch of credit for work that they had done over the course of the years. But what was immediately apparent in those 2 cases was that this template had been present in both cases, where the victims' bodies were found. Law enforcement had reached out to Dr. Stephen Hain, who was a sort of go-to forensic pathologist in the state. He was the only really practicing forensic pathologist. He had done the initial autopsy. He thought he saw pattern marks on the first little girl, and then he sort of asked that his friend and colleague, Dr. Michael West, who is the country dentist in the book, that he come in and determine whether these were in fact pattern injuries, and if so, what they were. And so Dr. West came in and did his analysis and determined that they were in fact bite marks, and that they could have belonged only to one person, and that was Levon Brooks, who was the chief suspect. So Levon Brooks went to trial. He was convicted. It was a capital murder case. The jury came back, and he got sentenced to life, not death. But within, I think it was about 18 months later, an identical murder happened just about 8 miles as the crow flies in Noxubee County. 3-year-old girl abducted in the middle of the night, manually strangled, sexually assaulted, and thrown into a body of water. Dr. Hain is called in to do the autopsy. He thinks he sees pattern marks. He calls in Dr. West. Dr. West comes in, says, sure enough, that's what they are. They're bite marks, and matches the marks, in this case, to Kennedy Brewer. It's also a capital murder charge, and this time the case is actually tried in Lowndes County, not Noxubee, and there's a whole story behind that. But Kennedy Brewer, unfortunately, but deeply fortunately, as the story would turn out, gets convicted and sentenced to death, based almost exclusively on the bite marks. I say fortunately because people on death row have attorneys throughout the pendency of their post-conviction claims, and so he was able to access people to help him, including ultimately the Innocence Project. But once they were exonerated, once DNA testing had been done, they had been excluded, the true perpetrator had been identified, it became sort of apparent that something had been up with Dr. Hain and Dr. West. What they had been up to, for how long, what the contours of it was, no one knew exactly at that point. But since that point, which is about 10 years ago, we've gone back and sort of looked at the body of their work over time, litigated cases, and I think that sort of gives you a sense of who they were and what they were doing.
So how many, and this is all in detail in the book, but there's something like he was doing 1,500 cases a year or something, and autopsies, right, in these cases, which was, I think, 1,000 cases over what the recommended limit was. I mean, there was so clearly these like patterns of just, this is not being done correctly, and and you've, thanks to your work, a lot of this has been exposed, and but how much of this is still in place, sort of this corrupt infrastructure of like the forensic evidence, and the, how many of the people are still in place? How many of the...
Well, I'll try to make this answer more concise than my last one, but in essence, what had happened was this. The state of Mississippi had, and actually even now, it sort of reared its head again, was deeply underfunding the state medical examiner's office. It was not offering a competitive salary. There was no way, essentially, to employ anyone in that office. And so for close to 2 decades, this state had no chief medical examiner. Instead, what was happening was that counties were going out and sort of hiring freelance pathologists. But as it turned out over time, Dr. Haynes sort of cornered the market, because what he did was he ingratiated himself as a private pathologist and would make himself available. He would do this incredible number of autopsies, which is sort of your first question. The National Association of Medical Examiners, which is sort of the guiding, governing oversight board, who actually will certify pathology labs around the country, says that a pathologist shouldn't do any more than, I think it's 250 autopsies per year, 300 if you have a certain amount of help, 350 depending on your staff. If you do any more than 350, I think it is, they won't certify you. For years, Dr. Haynes was doing between 1,600 and 2,000 autopsies per year, and he was doing them in bulk. And he was making, as he would say in all kinds of depositions, he was making hundreds of thousands of dollars a year doing these autopsies. I think the salary of the medical examiner, state medical examiner in the late 80s and early 90s was $65,000. I think it went up to $90,000. So you could make significantly more money doing it privately than you could on a salaried basis in the medical examiner's office. That didn't account for the amount of money he would make testifying in cases, and doing other work. So that was sort of the lay of the land for 20 years. And I think the other part of your question was, we still don't know sort of what the extent of the damage was, either because that damage arose because he was doing far too many autopsies than was allowed. There's a lot of stories out there, a couple of which we document in the book. One where a Mississippi Department of Corrections inmate had his, prior to becoming an inmate, had his spleen removed in a splenectomy, which are not uncommon. Then he got arrested, ended up being incarcerated, and died. He got very, very sick at Parchman, but died in a hospital, I think, in Clarksdale, if I'm not mistaken. Dr. Haynes did the autopsy because there was a question about how he had died, who sort of should be responsible for that. And among other things, Dr. Haynes' findings was that he had a perfectly normal spleen. The problem was he didn't have a spleen. And so there were sort of, mistakes like that on one end of the spectrum, if that in fact was a mistake. And the other end of the spectrum was, for example, the Brooks and Brewer cases, where it was clear that he and Dr. West were working to sort of solve these cases. Let me just say one other thing, which is that, in essence, one of the things we talk about in the book was that, and this is not unique to Mississippi, but Mississippi has sort of perfected the technique, which is we created a privatized, wrongly incentivized system for the medical legal profession here for those 2 decades. So instead of paying a salary to an objective medical examiner at the state medical examiner's office in Jackson, we farmed out privately, sort of like to this one person who was trying to satisfy a customer base, all these autopsies. And you can see through the Brooks and Brewer cases the example of what happens when you do that, or can happen when you do that.
So is there any way to know how many people now currently may be wrongfully convicted thanks to that same testimony, that he was so productive? Is there any way of estimating, how many people may be in jail right now because of bite mark testimony? Not really, but what I can tell you is that for 2 decades, he did 80 or 85% of all the autopsies in the state. Now, to be clear, in a typical homicide case, what the pathologist testifies to is not going to be critical. The person died of a gunshot wound. It may not be a contested fact in the case. The person died of strangulation. That may not be a contested fact. Who strangled him, who shot the person may be contested, but not how the person died. Shot, right? So it's not to say that every case that Dr. Haynes or Dr. West was involved in is necessarily problematic. It's not. But therein sort of lies your question, which is how do you know? And we don't, unless some
entity or person in sort of position of power and responsibility in the state would agree to, for lack of a better word, an audit of those cases over that period of time. We need to go back and look, because we wouldn't necessarily have known about Kennedy Brewer's case. I sort of glossed over it. The issues in Mr. Brewer's case from his early appellate attorneys weren't that he was innocent. It was only because Mr. Brewer himself wrote a letter to the Innocence Project that they ended up doing post-conviction DNA testing. So my point is, you wouldn't necessarily know about the cases. There were a lot of cases where people pled guilty, where there is no record. And so absent, some robust effort to sort of go back and audit the cases that these folks were involved in, we likely will never be able to answer your question, which is how many people out there are innocent who are locked up.
One of the things that struck me, and I've asked you this before, but you've done this investigative reporting essentially on your own work that you've done and as part of your case, and you've exposed, made it very plain how kind of corrupt it is, and then you still work in the state of Mississippi. You still, go to court, and did you ever worry about whether or not anyone was going to try to stop you from publishing this book, or if it was going to make it difficult for you to continue doing this work once that was?
I made sure to get tenure before I published the book, I'll tell you that, for whatever good that does you these days. But I did have, my dear colleague who's in the office next to me, who's not quite as dear as the colleague in the office next to him, who's my wife, but he's still a dear colleague. He did say, and I think it's a fair, or did ask, and I think it's a fair question. He would pick up, he helped with the manuscript some, and he would hold up the manuscript and he'd say, "Are you going to continue to litigate in this state after you publish this book? Because you're not going to be a popular person." And it did give me some pause, but one of the things that I found frustrating, I actually had this conversation earlier today with a journalist, was that one of the things that's frustrating about being a lawyer sometimes is you owe a duty to your client, and you don't and that duty generally does not include criminal justice reform. Your client could care less about criminal if that happens on his watch, so be it, but he wants his case taken care of. And so you don't often get the opportunity as an attorney for a particular client, the kind of clients we represent, to advance systemic reform. And that can be frustrating because you work hard for 10 years and then you look up and the landscape seems no better than it was when you started 10 years ago. In fact, arguably, you're complicit in it because you participated in the system. And so in that way, I think I did want to write the book because I wanted to say, I felt like the story needed to be told in one place, and I wasn't able to tell it in the individual discrete cases that we were litigating. The other thing I would say is, as I'm banging on all your questions, is I've really been, I'm sure there are people that are upset by the book.
But the reception here, has it been different than anywhere else?
No, it's been nice. It's been nicer in some way, more personal. I've gotten two emails which really were nice by lawyers who were who are older than I am, and that's important because they said, "I'm so glad that someone finally told this story. It needed to be told. It's painful, and it was painful to write because it's not fun calling out people really, or at least it's not for me. But the reception has been nice because people by and large have said, it's upsetting, it's painful, but I'm glad that you did it. Now, I'm sure there are people out there that wish we hadn't, would take issue with things we say in the book or whatever. That's fine, but at least the information, the reception that I've gotten has been thus far good and nice and supportive.
So one thing that I was, thinking about when you hear about exonerations and a wrongful conviction, It feels like this big, this legal victory, this victory for justice, and this cause for celebration. But and then you see the reality of that, and what is that like? What is justice for someone who's been away for 30 years, and is it possible? Is $500,000 and freedom now? And it always strikes me. It's like, is there ever really a justice served in any of these cases?
That's a great question, and it's one that before I came down here to run the Innocence Project, I was a public defender in D.C. and on occasion, rarely, not every time, I would get an acquittal in a trial. And there is that moment, when you feel like, oh, this is like great. And you are happy for your client, and to be honest, you're also, your ego, it's kind of nice, to get an acquittal. But then, particularly in DC, or in any sort of big urban courthouse, there's just immediately, you just feel, your client has been through all of this. In a murder case, for example, the victim's family's in the courtroom, and the acquittal doesn't bring back the person that was killed. I mean, there's just deep hurt and pain and trauma all the way around still, even though there was a not guilty verdict. I find that to be the case, though different in these exoneration cases. I mean, there really is nothing better than walking out of the courthouse with somebody 10, 12, 15 years after they were locked up. There is a sense of vindication. And
in the case of LaVon and Kennedy, how much time had they been?
They had served 30 years total between them. And Kenny had been on death row for, I think, 7 of those years. Mm-hmm. And it was a nice moment to walk out with them. And they got to do things that they never would have gotten. In fact, it was about February or early March when they got exonerated. The Innocence Network has a big conference every year, annual conference. And that year it was in like mid-March on the coast of California. And the Innocence Project they have the money to bring all the exonerees from that year to the conference. And so within a couple weeks of getting out, LaVon Brooks, who had never traveled, I think he lived in Knoxville, I think he had been over the border into Alabama once. He finds himself on his first airplane flight going to Northern California, and there's a great story about that. He was locked up pre-9/11, exonerated post-9/11, so he didn't have any forms of identification. And his birth certificate and his driver's license had been lost in the decade plus he had been locked up. He couldn't find any of that. I called the Mississippi DMV and I said, hey, listen, is there any way you could make an exception for this guy? No, of course not, And I called you, it was American Airlines, and I said, hey, I got this issue. This is all, by the way, answering your question. I said, is there any nice things of justice? Yeah. I called American Airlines and I said, look, I got this guy, right? He wants to go to California. He's never been on an airplane. He doesn't have any ID. All he has, get this, is a parchment penitentiary ID that has no date on it. And they were like, this is fantastic. We'll have 2 gate agents to meet him, which they did. They ushered him on the plane. He flew, scared out of his mind, got to California, and within 24 hours was waiting in the Pacific. He had his pants rolled up. He got to see the giant redwoods. It was fantastic. Unfortunately, and this is a part I wanted to talk about, LaVon also got diagnosed with stomach cancer about 3 years after he had gotten out. And he did very, very well for a period of time. He had terrific doctors in Columbus. In fact, he had a doctor in New York, an Israeli doctor, who was helping him. And I would get on the phone with the 3 of them, and it was like I was the UN interpreter.
Later.
because the UN doctor's name was Shalom Kalnicki, terrific person. He'd say, "Oh, LaVon, how are you doing?" LaVon would say, "Tucker, what'd he say?" And I said, "He's asking how you're doing," and he said, "Tell him I'm doing fine." And then Shalom would say, "Tucker, I didn't understand anything he just said. What did LaVon say?" And then I would translate. He did very well for a period of time, and then really over last Thanksgiving and Christmas got sicker, and he died in early February, just before the book came out. And I rushed down there. I got there the afternoon he had died. I was just a little bit late. And he was a terrific person. I mean, some of you all, I think, have met him. He would come to Ole Miss a lot and speak to students. He was this charismatic individual, and it broke my heart for that reason. But seeing him there in his house, having just, life's not fair, of course, but you just thought, man, this is a guy who should have, if there's somebody somewhere in heaven or somewhere, depending on whatever you believe in, there ought to have been somebody there who has said, you know what, actually this guy, he gets 13 more added because he missed that time. And it didn't work like that. Yeah. If I could, may I read a portion of, with everybody's indulgence, because I think we owe it to Levant for me to read this section of the book. Just real contextually, I got to give you a couple. Forrest Allgood, who's mentioned here, was the prosecutor in his case. And then there's another individual who identified Levant as the person who took her little sister. She was 5 at the time. And she obviously was wrong and was brokenhearted about having misidentified him. And her name is Ashley. And they're both mentioned in this. And then there's one other, I guess these are all teasers to buy the book or something. I don't mean it like that. There's another guy here who was the foreman of Levant's jury. They had actually grown up together. Levant's dad and uncle worked on a plantation in Noxubee County, and this gentleman's dad and grandfather owned and managed the plantation. So if everybody's indulgence, let me just read this. It's real brief. It's a couple pages, but this is for Levant. I'm happy, says Levant Brooks. He's sipping from a Sprite bottle filled with rum. For the first time since I can remember, I'm happy. It's a cool afternoon in December 2015. Levant and Dinah Brooks live in a trailer home between Brooksville and Columbus. They met while he was in prison. She worked in the cafeteria. Brooks had proposed years ago, but he never seemed interested in setting a date, and Dinah ribbed him for that. Behind their house, a menagerie of hunting dogs, chickens, rabbits, and other animals bark, cluck, bay, and scurry around in their coops. Friends and neighbors stop by, sometimes stay a while to chat. The place bustles with life. Most who meet Brooks are immediately struck by his presence. Ed Blake, the famous DNA analyst in California who worked on Brooks and Brewer's cases, recalls the first time he met Brooks. He's not a big man, Blake says. There are some people that simply have a look about them that commands one's attention, and Levant Brooks is one of those individuals. He hardly has to talk to you before you're drawn to him to engage in a conversation. And then once you engage in that conversation, his charisma and his dignity simply flow. Brooks's declaration of happiness becomes all the more poignant a few minutes later when he lifts his shirt to reveal the pump that's sending chemotherapy through his body. He was diagnosed with stomach cancer, but he has good doctors in Mississippi, and the Innocence Project put him in touch with a leading oncologist in New York, and his prognosis is good. On this chilly afternoon, Brooks is dressed in a T-shirt and camouflage pants, and his hair is in braids. He offers his guests some deer jerky and then shows off his new rifle. "Did you hear about Allgood?" he asks. "I campaigned for the new guy, and I think I like him," he says, and he flashes a Cheshire smile. When asked if he holds any resentment for the men who convicted him, Brooks points out that Allgood apologized to him on the day he was released, but the two men haven't spoken since. Not that they necessarily would have been friends under different circumstances. Noxubee County is a small, close-knit community, but it's also largely segregated. So what about former Deputy Eichelberger, who led the investigation? Has he apologized? "Not in words," Levant says, "but he doesn't talk much. He gave me a hunting dog after I got out. I think that was his way of saying he's sorry. We hunt deer together sometimes." Within about 10 minutes of meeting Brooks, odds are pretty good that he'll ask you if you'd like to go hunting with him. He just assumes you'll love it as much as he does. Since he got out, Brooks has been on the receiving end of more than a few such invitations. One came from his old childhood friend, Boz Stevens, the foreperson of the jury that convicted him, who lets Brooks hunt and fish on the family farm. Stevens has since come full circle. In a way, so is the plantation where he and Brooks grew up. Stevens' mother died a few years ago, and since then the farm has been rented out to contract farmers. In an interview several years earlier, just before Christmas, Stevens pondered his role in Brooks's trial. He stood in his yard just outside the cabin that Brooks's aunt and uncle called home, back when they were some of the last tenant farmers on the farm. For certain, he said, he regretted what had happened. He was happy that he and Brooks were on friendly terms again, though he wishes there were some way to make things whole. Asked to reflect on his heritage, the trial, and what had happened since, he leaned up against his pickup truck and thought for a moment. I should add that Boswell Stevens' grandfather was a virulent segregationist who was president of the Mississippi Farm Bureau. Boswell Stevens says, "Well, I'm not my grandfather," and then added after a pause, "and he wasn't me." Shortly after Brooks was released, Ashley Smith apologized to him too for identifying him as the man who abducted her sister. She didn't need to, of course. He never blamed her. Some 25 years ago, LaVon Brooks left the job he loved at the Santa Barbara Club to clear up any misunderstanding with the Noxubee County Sheriff's Department. He told his friends he'd be right back. He never came back. Now, with some of his wrongful conviction money, he's back in the entertainment business. He and Dinah opened a cafe behind his house. They named it D&T's Hill City Hideaway. The modest, cozy spot serves up fried foods, sodas, and beer. Baseball caps and saggy pants are not allowed. On Saturday afternoons, they show college football, and at night they dance. Early last summer, the Hill City Hideaway hosted a wedding, that of its owners. LaVon had finally come around. A photographer from New York who had become a good friend drove down to shoot the affair. The weather was hot. The dress was casual. Dinah wore a peach chiffon dress. LaVon wore white head to toe, a white hat, a white linen shirt, white jeans, and white leather cowboy boots. There was a lot of dancing.
It's so beautiful that I have to commend you, and as a journalist, there's envy too, because you actually write beautifully about the work that you've done, which is not always, doesn't seem to be the case necessarily, and there's always a lot of jokes about lawyerly writing, but this is such a beautiful, I'm glad that you read that.
Well, since Radley's not here, I'll take credit for it, but I think he might have had something to do with that.
Well, no,
I would have had some footnotes in it or something.
But I definitely want to ask you about that, because you've written, it's interesting because we know what happened. It's not a like a what happened sort of book. You already know what happened before you start, but it's about how and why, and you've sort of, I'm curious about your process of writing it and working with him, and kind of having to be a reporter of your own experience, really. You're having to kind of go back and just, if you can talk about that process, what that's like a little bit. I mean, is there is it difficult, or was it always, I mean, I don't know if I'm not putting the question on it. I guess I'm saying, you know, were you switching hats, I guess, between being an attorney and then trying to be an author?
Well, I like writing, and I like narrative nonfiction. So with that, I didn't have much of an issue. The issue more was co-authoring a book with somebody, and we had our moments, but.
He's not here. Tell us all about
I mean,
them.
they were all his fault. I was a lovely partner to work with at all times. There is a part of the book when Radley and I do these things that Radley reads from, and he said his wife, who's a journalist at The Intercept, said she was reading the book, and she says, "Oh, I love this part." And he's like, "What?" She goes, "This is probably my favorite part in the book." And he says, "Which part's that?" And he's like, "You wrote that part," he said to me. And so he usually reads that. But
is that how it worked? Like, you actually had sections that you...
Radley had been covering these stories for about 10 years, so we had a lot of material. Right. I had written a version of this book, which, as you say, was like so overly lawyerly that it was just deadly dull. No one in their right mind would ever buy it, much less read it. And so we sort of put the two together. And it worked. I like Radley. He has a totally different personality from me. He's a journalist. He can churn out some pages. It takes me forever to write something. That one part that his wife said she liked was about believe it or not, it was about part of it anyway. It was about the geography of Noxubee County, which it does read pretty nicely now, but only because I was channeling my inner John McPhee. So there was like pages after pages of this history of geology, which was like awful. And Radley did take it and edit it down, and it works. But it was co-authoring something is not for the faint of heart.
But you're still friends, so that's a good sign.
Yeah, we're still friends.
Did you get connected from, was he originally covering like the work and then that's how you got connected, or did you know him? How did you two partner?
He had come down, actually he's a dyed in the wool, can you say this? He's a yellow dog libertarian, if there is such a thing. He had come down to Mississippi in 2007 to cover a capital murder trial death case near Monticello, Mississippi, where a SWAT team had burst into a duplex, and a deputy they had been shot at, and a deputy had been killed. Actually, the son of the sheriff. They had broken into the wrong duplex, and Radley was interested in it from a libertarian perspective on sort of the militarization of American police forces. But when he came down to cover the case, Dr. Hain was testifying, and he was testifying about ballistics, which was a whole nother area of his expertise. And Radley sort of thought, like, this seems odd. I had just started right over here, or here at the old law school, and we didn't have any cases yet. And I had a phone, but it was in the other wing of the office. There was like a half wall, and I had really nothing to do. And one day the phone rang, and I thought, like, this is my first phone call. So I dove for the phone because it gave me some credibility, which I did not have. And it was Radley just sort of introducing himself and asking me, various and sundry questions, including, did I know anything about this Dr. Hain character? And that sort of was the beginning of our relationship.
So back to him and the forensics and the stuff that you go into in the book, is there, you make it plain that it's worse here, right? As you said, like, Mississippi's really made an art of perfected the art of bad science when it in the courtroom. But are there places where it works, or where it works better, or where it just seems so arbitrarily applied? And I'm curious if there is a template for how it works better.
There are jurisdictions where it works better, and they are jurisdictions where, when I practiced in Washington, D.C., I litigated against the U.S. Attorney's Office for reasons which seem odd, but the district's odd. It's not a real state, it's something, or whatever. And the U.S. Attorney's Office would prosecute cases. That is a very well-funded office with, by and large, terrific ethical prosecutors who have lots of resources available to them, including professional detectives and a depending professional police force. And they can and frequently do put together terrific cases. The Public Defender Service, where I worked in D.C., is known as the best public defender service in the country, in large part because they are very, very well funded. When I was there, I had, at all times, at least 2 investigators. Oftentimes, when the summer came around and law students would come to intern, I had 4 or 5 investigators, 2 law clerks. I had 2 or 3 social workers available to me at any one time, and a stable of terrific attorneys. My salary was good. I had a retirement with the federal government. But in D.C. Superior Court, where we litigated, terrific judges who believed in the process. And we didn't always get it right. The district D.C. has had wrongful convictions too, because we're not perfect. But it was a jurisdiction where there was vigorous, aggressive prosecution, but there was also vigorous defense work, well-funded, aggressive defense lawyering, where there was this expectation and this culture that is what you would bring to the table. You would leave nothing, in the defense of your client. We weren't perfect, but it was terrific. And there are other examples of that. Philly has a terrific office. There are various pockets in California, and in odd places where you wouldn't otherwise expect it, there will be these cultures that for whatever reason have grown up, which are like the culture that I just described. Then there's places like Mississippi, where we chronically underfund our public defenders, where frankly the district attorneys in the state don't have the resources they need. Law enforcement training is not what it should be, and we have whole vacuums like in the medical legal system, which we document in the book. And then, it's just this perfect storm that develops here in a place like this anyway.
I've never asked you this before, but I'm curious about just at the law school, how many people, and you're obviously not going to have a specific answer, but I'm curious how many people come into law school knowing they want to do public defense work or capital defense work, or is that something that happens, how does that happen, and how did it happen for you?
I actually went to law. I taught high school for several years before I went to law schools, and I knew that I wanted to be a criminal defense attorney. That's just what I wanted. I did, but most people I think don't, and by and large, I think most people don't consider criminal defense to be their calling. As my mom used to say, even when I was a public defender at DC, she says, "No, so what are you doing?" And I would explain to her. She says, "But I want to feel safe in DC, so why are you doing that?" Which I think is a general reaction from people, but it's a honorable part of the profession. There is really no greater feeling than the standing beside someone who's giving you permission to represent them in when they're facing their loss of liberty or loss of their life. I think, but anyway, to get to your question, most people in law school who do have an interest in criminal work want to be prosecutors, not defense attorneys, which is fine, I should add, and I welcome them into my class because prosecutors have far, far more power than criminal defense attorneys do, and to the extent that we want to make systemic change, those are the people that we need to work with. But no, not a lot of people. Some, but not a lot of people want to go into criminal defense work.
So when you talk about systemic change, and were you looking at this kind of methodically? I mean, if you look back, way back, and say, were you okay? I'm going to be looking at false forensic evidence, and really, or did that happen as a result of the case, or what was the chicken and the egg on
the Dr. Hain and Dr. West are like the gift that keeps on giving, and the systemic reform, to the extent that there has been any, has come as a secondary part of the discrete litigation in the cases.
And you're now working with another conviction case. Did I have that correct? Eddie Howard, is that in process?
We have two more at the moment, two more cases, actually, if you can believe this, both the death cases, one out of Lowndes County, same prosecutor, same judge, Dr. Hain and Dr. West, which is almost exclusively a bite mark case, which the state is contesting. That's the Eddie Lee Howard case. And then we're in circuit court. We had an evidentiary hearing. We're waiting for a ruling from the judge. We have another case out of DeSoto County, which we won in the Mississippi Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court vacated the conviction and death sentence. I think it was a 23-year-old conviction. That's back in DeSoto County. But if you can believe it, there are still death cases too, out there that are, we're waiting for some resolution.
I don't know how we are on time, but I didn't know if you want to go ahead and ask some questions. Let audience ask if they have anything. The one thing I was going to still ask on my list, if nobody's, I don't do this in my class either. I should give enough time. Oh, there we go.
I heard your question when you asked about what constitutes justice after 30 years of prison. And I don't know. I don't know whether you answered the question now, because I don't know if there is an answer to that question. Because also, there's no answer to the question if the injured party, if there's a conviction, that's not justice for that person. So it seems to me that the only way we can have justice is that if we create a
Well, you raise a good point, most of which is way beyond my pay grade. but I agree with you. At least, I think to go back to my answer to the question, was one of the things that I found upsetting in those scenarios where there was an acquittal, or even in some of these exonerations, is the sort of senselessness of what had happened. Just in most cases, right? Just the sort of nonsense, the needless violence that had happened. There's a colleague of mine who's coming out with a book next year, and it's a book about restorative justice. And there's some jurisdictions around the country, including the District of Columbia, that have done this in less serious sort of non-violent cases. Property crimes, low-level drug offenses, assaultive conduct that doesn't end up in any kind of serious bodily injury. Instead of going the sort of typical route, which is for the U.S. Attorney's Office to file charges and then saddle someone potentially with a misdemeanor or felony conviction, they've diverted it into these courtrooms where, I'm oversimplifying it, but essentially where the fact finder is the community. And the community addresses not only the behavior of, in this case, of the alleged perpetrator, and addresses that, but also addresses in context the damage or injury that the victim or the victim's family has suffered. And then also takes all of that into some larger context of the community. Like, what does the community need from this? How does the community address the antisocial behavior that started this ball rolling? And how does the community address how does the community make whole the victims in the case, right? Because if you have a stolen car case, right, you might get your car back, but the transmission, the steering column is busted out. And so they got the guy and they gave him 6 months or whatever, but that doesn't help your car. Your car's still busted. And so there's this sort of holistic approach to all of this. And I think it's worked well in a lot of communities, like the courts in D.C. I think they've really been receptive to it. It's worked well. Now, that said, that doesn't answer your question about, and I do think that there are instances of antisocial behavior which are much harder to answer your question or question, sort of homicides, some types of homicides, some types of violent sexual assault. And child sex abuse cases, I think, raise much more difficult questions about how to stop those sorts of antisocial behavior before it starts, because the causes of those sometimes are much more complex, and you can't divert those cases and expect a community to sort of come together and heal in any way, because the damage is too profound.
What about in this sort of current turbulent political climate? Are there things? Can you draw a line to, an impact that might have on capital defense cases or wrongful convictions or?
One of the things that's really interesting, or at least I think is interesting, is and we talk about at some length in the book. If you read it, maybe you think it's at too much length, but is the atmosphere that was present at the time of these convictions. And it was in the Clinton administration. If you all remember, there was a Republican congressional push to speed up executions in the country. And there was this back and forth on this piece of legislation called the Anti-Effective Death Penalty Act, which was going to institute all these timelines for capital defendants. They had a year to litigate everything, and then they were going to be executed.
Was that because one of the common criticisms was that, like, these people spend 20 years on death row, and so
they did, right?
We're going to make it efficient.
Exactly. We're going to get this done. There was a lot of pushback because people in the know, judges and lawyers, knew that these cases are complicated. There was all sorts of stuff that needed to be looked at. You couldn't possibly do it within a year. A lot of post-conviction folks didn't have lawyers. Then the Oklahoma City bombing happened, and within days, the legislation was signed into law. And you guys remember the last election and what Bill Clinton, in particular Hillary, had to answer for with respect to their position on criminal justice back then. But the interesting part, in Mississippi at the time was right on board. The governor wanted to make Mississippi the capital of capital punishment. This Clarion Ledger for 2 or 3 times ran pictures of everybody on death row and underneath what their crime was and how long they had been on death row. Like, we should be done with this by now. One of the photos, of course, was of Kennedy Brewer, who was innocent. I think there's lessons to be learned from that era. And the other day in my class, I showed Ken Burns' documentary about the Central Park Five, the case in the 80s. And one of the featured interviewees was a guy who we'll all know, who was in a different position then than he is now, Donald Trump, who was interviewed in the Burns documentary as saying, we should go ahead and just put these guys to death right away and we'll just be done with it. He took out a full-page ad in the New York Times saying that the death penalty should be brought back for rape cases. They were all innocent, as it turns out. If there's anyone who evidently can't learn anything from history, it's our President Trump, because the other day he just advocated once again for the death penalty for drug dealers. So his comments have the same flavor as the era that we're going through during these wrongful convictions of Mr. Brooks and Mr. Brewer. So I think there are lessons to be learned. I have met Dr. Hain. The question was, have I met Dr. Hain, and is it fair to say he's an advocate for his position? I have met him. I met him a couple of times, once because he sued me, and I've met him in court on a couple of occasions, quite pleasant. Very smart, and I think when he put his mind to it, was a very talented pathologist. The problem, as I think we document in the book, is that he put his mind to far too many autopsies over the years. But he is. I don't know if that answers your question. Yes, ma'am. He was paid by the counties.
Okay, so there was nobody at the state level that was understanding, because they couldn't afford to pay a central medical examiner. Nobody was putting this together as to how many autopsies he was doing, how much money he was making.
Oh, people knew. People knew, but there was just
no oversight because he was a private practitioner.
There was. This is my view or our view in the book. There was no oversight. This is a complex question to answer. There was no, but our thesis in the book is that there was no oversight because people in positions of power and influence and responsibility who could have provided the oversight, who could have corrected the problem, found it perfectly fine that this seemed to be working, and it was cost effective because the state government was not having to pay for it. And Mississippi at the time was starting this wave of locking up more people than any other state in the country, except for Louisiana, in a country that locks up per capita more than any other country in the world. And the reason I say it's a complex answer, though, is because we spend, I hope, the requisite amount of time in the 3rd chapter of the book talking about the history of the coroner and medical legal system in Mississippi. And one of the things we found was that, I hope this is responsive to your question, is that the coroner system in particular during the civil rights era had been used often to cover up civil rights murders. an African American, say, had George Lee in Belzona, who was a minister, had been driving home one night, and someone shot him with a shotgun, and his car veered off the road and ran into a house. The coroner was called, who was white. The coroner impaneled an all-white jury. I don't know how many of you all know how this used to work, but citizens, passerby, would be asked to come stand around the automobile accident or whatever it was, and the shooting, and determine whether this person died by natural causes or whether this was perhaps a violent death and there needed to be a law enforcement investigation and an autopsy. They showed up at the car where Reverend Lee was and determined that he had died, he had lost control of his car and had run into the house, and the buckshot in his head were just the fillings from his teeth that had been knocked loose when his car crashed. And in that case, and many, many others, remain unsolved because an all-white coroner's jury decided that the typical phrase was death by the hands of an unknown person, if it was clearly a lynching or something, or in this particular case, he had lost control of his car. That system morphed over time, but what we argue in the book is that the sort of systemic benefits to people in positions of power, that stayed the same. It wasn't used to effectuate cover-ups of race-based murders anymore in the 80s and 90s, but it was nevertheless used for other ends. And we argue sort of in the book that those other ends were an agenda that included being tough on crime, because that appealed to the legislature and the governor. It was an agenda where you could solve homicides, for instance, because that appealed to prosecutors and general public alike, like in these cases where these guys would come in and solve the crime. They'd find bite marks. So it was a sort of systemic problem which carried over from one era to another for different reasons, but it ultimately suited the status quo.
Do you consider that antisocial behavior? I mean, what that doctor was doing with all those autopsies, isn't that antisocial behavior, and shouldn't it be punished?
California, in their capital murder statute, has a provision which makes you eligible for capital murder if you fabricate evidence which gets someone indicted and prosecuted for capital murder. So not only do I think that kind of behavior, and I want to be clear that I'm not making the case in these particular cases right here and now for that, but I think that type of behavior and conduct is not only antisocial, I think it's criminal, and people ought to be prosecuted for it. These folks have not been prosecuted, and not only that, but Mr. Brooks and Mr. Brewer brought a 1983 civil rights claim against them. They lost in district court, and about 6 months ago finally got their opinion out of the Fifth Circuit. The Fifth Circuit agreed with the plaintiffs in the case, the defendants in the case, that Dr. West and Dr. Hain enjoyed immunity, civil immunity, for their opinions. And because Mr. Brooks and Mr. Brewer were unable evidentiarily to prove that Dr. Hain and Dr. West essentially made it up or acted recklessly, they were unable to sort of pierce the immunity veil that witnesses enjoy. Now, I have my issues with that. The Fifth Circuit opinion said that it's possible or even likely that Dr. Hain and Dr. West were grossly negligent in these cases, but gross negligence is not enough to pierce their civil immunity in the case. So they haven't been held criminally liable, and they haven't been held civilly liable either.
I have the last question because we're about out of time. Before the Innocence Project challenged Dr. Hain and Dr. West, had anyone in Mississippi, any journalist, any criminal defense lawyer really challenged them, gone after them? They seem to have operated in impunity for years and years.
Professor Wilke's question was, had anyone challenged Dr. Hain and Dr. West prior to these cases? The answer is because they seem to have worked without any repercussions. The answer is yes and no. And we talk about that in the book too. Yeah, there were some lawyers who had the means to challenge them, especially Dr. Hain. And this brings up a whole nother issue which we don't have time to get into. They were typically civil lawyers where money was at stake. There's a terrific deposition out of just into Alabama where Dr. Hain was caught lying about his credentials. But he was caught because the civil lawyers had the ability and the money and the time to dig into his claimed bona fides. And there were other instances. Rob McDuff, who some of you all know, and Jackson, terrific attorney, had a couple criminal cases, and Rob went after him and made some inroads. What's depressing and worrisome is that even though some trial and appellate courts knew about these problems and on rare occasions called them out, Dr. Hain and Dr. West themselves were not chastened, and nor were courts overly worried about the fact that this had happened, that this was going on. They would and could continue to testify with impunity. Let me say one more thing in the time. I mean, to answer your question, you would think that at some level in these two death penalty cases I mentioned, Eddie Lee Howard in particular, that the state would say, oh my goodness, this looks exactly like the Brooks and Brewer case, and we ought to do something about this. We ought to at the very least give Mr. Howard a new trial.
And who would be the we? Who would be
the Attorney General's office, Jim Hood, who's running, claims he's going to run for governor. He better not be running on a criminal justice platform because he has a lot to answer for, in my view. But nonetheless, not only is the state fighting us on these cases, they, as case law in support of the continued legitimacy of the admissibility of bite mark evidence, the lead cases in their brief are Levon Brooks and Kennedy Brewer's cases. Because if you go back and look at them, both of those cases were affirmed in the Mississippi Supreme Court. They were affirmed at least on one basis, the admissibility of bite mark evidence. And the way those cases have worked, that ruling has never been overturned. So those cases still stand for that proposition. And your level of shamelessness in citing to those two cases is in my mind unconscionable. But that's where we are. May I have a bit of the last word and thank the Overby Center, thank Cynthia for stepping in sort of at the last minute for Radley, who truly, really cannot talk. I talked with him today on the telephone. To Curtis for being such a good friend over the years and for having such good taste, not in having me, but in having James Foreman, who won the Pulitzer Prize. That's a huge deal. He had a lovely time here. He called me and asked me for a framed poster of the one that you all did. Anyway, many, many thanks to you and the Overby Center over the years, but particularly this year, for your support of this book and support of friends of mine who came down, and for all of you that came out tonight. I really appreciate it. Thanks for your interest.
Thank you for writing the book and for talking about it. It's really great.